When is a case ever really closed? When God closes a case, he opens a window into the soul of the perpetrator with a sole question. Why? Why did you do it? Why now? Why do they only give me video game crimes? Do they not trust me with a gun? Licensed or not, I'm locked, cocked, and ready to unload. A private dick like me has to take a beating and keep on coming. So you have to ask yourself, do you think you're hard enough? We're not leaving this room until you answer my question. Who drew this Nancy? If there's one thing I love more than anything, it's getting in over my head. Do you know how much fun it is to think, oh, I'll just play a Nancy Drew game because of the pun name? And then realize there's so much more you need to talk about? The entrance exam to get into the Drew crew is more difficult than the bar! When I wanted to talk about the Nancy Drew games, I had two options. Either talk about the first or latest Nancy games. Either start at the beginning or the present. So I looked at the first game, Secrets Can Kill. It seemed pretty fun. I played it as it was intended, with my mom, and it was great. I look at the latest Nancy Drew games though, Midnight in Salem and Mystery of the Seven Keys, and the response was overwhelmingly negative. Every Drew game that I looked at before this had a positive reaction. But these two seemed to rub fans the wrong way, and are some of the lowest rated games in the franchise. I got curious why they were so hated, and after doing some research, fell down a rabbit hole that took me through the center of the earth. Would you have guessed that the development of Nancy Drew point-and-click adventure games is a story that would span over 30 years, involve mystery hirings and firings, complete studio firings, and a mysterious billionaire behind it all? If you did, hi Nancy! Instead of looking at any single Nancy Drew game, I thought it would be fun to research and talk about the history of the Nancy Drew video games, and discuss why these latest two entries are so hated. And what could be next. So when you try to talk about the Nancy Drew games, you don't look at the beginning of the games, or even the company who made them. No, you're going back to 1930 to Edward Stratemeyer. Author of the already successful Hardy Boys series, Stratemeyer decided to capitalize with a series in a similar vein aimed at girls, the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories. While inventing the character, he wouldn't write any of the stories. In fact, in a Nancy Drew-level twist, the author of a lot of Nancy books doesn't exist, with the pen name Carolyn Keene being used for dozens of ghostwriters over the years, with the first and most prolific being Mildred Wirt Benson. 1930 was also the year that Edward Stratemeyer would die, and pass the reins of his company, the Stratemeyer Syndicate, to his daughter, Harriet Stratemeyer. The partnership between the Stratemeyers and the writers was as such. Mildred would write books and establish the character, while Harriet would take all the credit. It's a little bit more complicated than that, since Harriet was in charge of making the outlines for the stories that Mildred and the other ghostwriters would flesh out, but Harriet would end up claiming the work of over 28 ghostwriters as her own across her entire life, so take that however you want. The work of writers like Mildred made a character who was strong, independent, a nosy know-it-all detective who was revolutionary for the time. Women were only allowed to vote 10 years earlier. There was no amendment yet saying they could solve mysteries. Nancy was headstrong, feisty, the sort of character who hounded people until she got what she wanted. And for the audience of young girls the books were made for, she was aspirational. She represents freedom and being your own person. She drove her own car that she could repair herself. She didn't take sass. Adults listened to her and let her take control of a situation. Any young girl could read that and have a standard they could try to live up to. Having somebody to look up to in 1930s America was important too, since the Roaring 20s gave way to the I'm gonna kill myself 30s. Despite the economic stranglehold the population was under in this era, Nancy remained popular, with books of hers like Secret of the Old Clock and The Password to Lakespur Lane selling out in days. Nancy solidified herself as an American icon with the help of writers like Mildred, Walter Carrig, Alma Sassi, George Waller Jr., and even Harriet Straitmeyer. Part of the reason they became so popular was due to their release schedule. Between 1930 and 2003, there was only 1 year without a Nancy Drew book. And that was more than made up for by the sometimes 5 books releasing in a single year. Nancy Drew really was the Garten of Banban of I actually can't do this anymore. In that time, Nancy's look and attitude would update to represent what a young girl in America actually looked like, all without aging a day. Nancy's influence is so widespread, it's hard to even quantify. So many peppy, headstrong female characters are directly or indirectly inspired by Nancy Drew, and several real-world women also cite her as an influence. I could go on for hours about Nancy Drew and her influence, but for the sake of what we're all here for, I'm going to skip ahead to the late 1980s, and you are just gonna have to go along with me because I swear I can tie this back to Drew.
No! No! Shoot the fuse!
American Laser Games was a company founded in the late 1980s by Robert Grieb, innovator of the ICAT system. This was technology used by police training centers that mixed live-action footage with light gun technology and sensors, to allow the software to recognize not only if a shot had been fired, but the position of a gun, admonishing people who pulled their guns too quickly. Seeing the potential in this technology for entertainment, Robert would create ALG and use it to create multiple successful light gun games for arcades. Mad Dog McCree, Fast Draw Showdowns, and Crime Patrol all used this technology to great effect, standing out especially thanks to their live-action presentation. As the 90s rolled on, it became more clear that the market was turning away from arcades and towards home consoles. So ALG decided not just to jump into this more lucrative market, but tap into a demographic virtually nobody did. As is becoming a theme for Nancy Drew content, ALG realized that the gaming industry was catering entirely to boys. Games for girls were extremely rare on home consoles and PC, and the few that were released were usually tied to the hyper-feminine Barbie. Seeing an opening they could fill, ALG established a subsidiary called Her Interactive, which would focus on making games for girls. These games would release exclusively for PC as well, seeing as the number of girls who owned a game console versus the number whose family owned a computer was so drastic that sending their games out to the SNES and Genesis would be sending them out to die. Her Interactive would start out with a dating game called Mackenzie & Co., but would quickly find a niche within the niche of girl gamers who didn't want girly things. If a game targeted at girls was going to be released, it would be pastel pink, be about fashion, or dating, or dolls, or makeup, and there was a niche outside of that was completely uncatered to. This wouldn't just result in a stupid clever slogan, for girls who aren't afraid of a mouse, but also lead to them getting the license to Nancy Drew for the purposes of making video games. Given the pedigree the name and character carried, this was a huge get for the company. And in 1998, the first of what would be 34 Nancy Drew point-and-click adventure games would be released, Secrets Can Kill. The first game already comes with loads of interesting history, like how a large part of the game's success was down to Amazon, the other one. It turns out that Her Interactive and Amazon were established in the same town, Bellevue, Washington. Seeing as the two were cut from the same cloth, Jeff Bezos saw this as a chance to help out both companies, and used his company to help sell Secrets Can Kill. Not only was the game purchasable off of Amazon.com, but employees would be given printouts, flyers, and pamphlets all promoting what would be the first in the series. Secrets Can Kill set the template for every game to follow for the next 31. They were point-and-click adventure games that starred Nancy Drew. voiced by video game voiceover great Lonnie Manella. Yep, for 32 games, Nancy Drew was voiced by Rouge the Bat and Lucas from Mother 3. Get these three in a room, I want to hear them talk politics. They would run on Her's proprietary engine created for their previous game, Vampire Diaries, which allowed for either green-screened actors, 2D sprites, or 3D models to exist in a 3D space that would be explorable via various screens. Secrets Can Kill is different from most games in the series, as it's only one of two to include a killing as the inciting incident, with only Deadly Device featuring the same thing. The timelines don't match up, but I swear to God this box art is traced. You see it too, right? The games would feature item collecting, interrogations, puzzle solving, and mini-games leading up to the big reveal of the culprit, where Nancy calls the police. Okay, she's an 18-year-old white girl, that's the most dangerous thing she can do. Having played Secrets Can Kill with my mom after I told her about the idea of doing the Nancy Drew games, we had a great time. I immediately saw a lot of what the wider Drew crew saw in these games. The compact map and limited character pool gave you a chance to become intimately familiar with the cast. And with the plot being about a murder, it made every character's tiny moments of nastiness feel darker and more twisted, as you try to piece together what could be the motive for a murder. The cast might be stereotypes, but they're at least memorable. The jock, the nerd, the ladies' man, the hall monitor. Their names? F if I know, but I did remember them. The game also does a great job with the story we don't see. Jake might be dead, but through the game we find out how he created a lot of problems for himself, which makes untangling who killed him and why all the harder. Dead ends and puzzles actually open up whole other routes to try to get back to the main story. And puzzles had these wonderful aha moments, where you finally read a coded message in the right way or discover a hidden element. It felt fantastic. Above all else, the game has a very cozy feeling to it. I think the school setting and general vibe that the characters and music gave off made the game feel really comfortable despite the grim subject. When you look into the community that surrounds the series, the term comfort game comes up a lot. And it's not hard to see why. The Nancy Drew games act like books on a shelf. These 4 to 5 hour long mysteries that require more brainpower than you'd expect from what's marketed as a kid's game. There is no time limit. Rarely are you put in a fatal situation. It's a game you can complete at your own pace. That difficulty as well showcases that the game's being for children has no real bearing on what they expect from the player. It doesn't matter if it's a kid's game or a girl's game, they offer challenges that are still going to get you thinking critically and make you feel smart for solving them. If you want to call them edutainment games, they're some of the best edutainment games out there. But really, they're just regular point-and-click adventure games that happen to appeal to young girls. And appeal it did! The first Nancy Drew game was a success, and sold enough to justify the existence of another game only a year later. 1999, though, was an even more significant year for Her Interactive, as while they rose, the company that created them began to fall. American Laser Games was failing fast in their attempts to make their light gun games work in homes, going all in on the 3DO. This motherfucker had Gex on it, how did it fail? ALG's fall, coinciding with Her's rise, led to a decision that, to that point, had never happened, and even today probably hasn't happened again. Seeing their increased stock, Her decided to buy out the remainder of American Laser Games and then sell it to Leisure Concepts, breaking the bond that kept the two together and making Her an independent company. With that, they would need to find a new CEO to replace Patricia Flanagan, the founder of Her Interactive and Robert Grebe's wife. And to take her place, they found Megan Geyser. Megan was an odd choice for the time, seeing as prior to her involvement with Her, she didn't have any experience in the games industry, instead spending time as a producer on documentaries and working closely with Microsoft for web-based content as such an idea became feasible. Megan carried on the ideas that Her had been founded on, Namely that girls weren't uninterested in games, simply that nobody was making games for them. She explains as much in this June 2000 interview with Adventure Classic Gaming. We are the only developer in the US focused exclusively on the girls' market. Which is rather bizarre. There are more than 70 million girls in our target age range, and they have about $45 billion to spend each year. All of this potential has been largely ignored by the computer game industry, which found it could sell a lot of violent action games targeting the male audience, and has stayed in that rut ever since. The market penetration for male-targeting games is near the saturation point, but there's still a wide-open opportunity to target the female half of the population. A recent study published by the American Association of University Women found that girls were largely turned off by the violent and repetitive nature of most games. If they're not buying games in large numbers, it's not because they don't like to play games. It's because few developers are designing games that appeal to them. Fitting for Her Interactive, Megan would become one of the very first female CEOs in the gaming industry. And with her at the helm, Her would, ironically, adopt a similar game release schedule that Nancy originally took up back in the 30s, with 2 game releases a year. How Her worked was that at any given time, there would be 2 Nancy Drew games in development at the same time, one big and one small. Depending on which was getting focus, the other would help shore up the weaknesses. If a short Nancy Drew game was in development, they could use the spare time to start planning out the big one. If a big one was in development, they could use the small one as a come-down, being able to focus on something easier in between the bigger Nancy Drew games. This plays into one more running trend in the Drew games that I held back on, and that's that at the end of each Nancy Drew game, there would be a trailer for the next one. That meant that most Nancy games would get about 6 months of development before release. The company was turning these games out at breakneck speeds. To do this, you'd need a humongous staff who were worked to the bone on every aspect of the game. Designers, writers, animators, testers, all working around the clock. Her Interactive, though, didn't do anything like this. In fact, they did the opposite. Her Interactive, at its peak, only had about 30 in-house employees, all working out of that Bellevue, Washington office. That number would increase with contract workers, which Her rarely employed, but even at its max occupancy of 50, Her Interactive had a tiny team compared to most. A company of a comparative size would be something like Humongous Entertainment, the company behind the putt-putt of Dark Souls games, Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo. Humongous would have around 60 employees at any given time, and even then took about 2 years to make a new game in one of their franchises. Compared to them, Her Interactive was working on double time. So then Megan Geyser must have been snapping the necks of interns as a show of dominance to keep them working, right? Cracking the whip to get these Drew games out so fast? Well, according to former employees, no. While Her couldn't afford to pay employees luxurious amounts, especially since, remember, Amazon is right down the road, it fostered an environment that gave security to its employees, lining up constant work for them that eventually got those 30 people into a great groove. They would work on the same technology and engine for years, on games with a very similar format for each one, all following the same theme. One at the start of the year, and one midway through, to release around June and December each year. Would it be the most exciting work in the world? No. But you want to know what's really exciting? Running water in your house! Her provided constant work for its developers in an environment that was often referred to as a home away from home. A small but passionate community of creators working on games they enjoyed, in a setting that made them feel valued. Think of how many horror stories there are in the game development industry. People being treated worse than pack animals and worked to the bone, having benefits and bonuses dangled out of grasp to keep them subservient. It's a story that from the biggest developer to even small indie teams comes up way too much. That makes a story like Her Interactive's much more unique. From the top brass to the on-the-ground developers making the games happen, there was an understanding of what was needed. The fact we could knock these games out every 6 months still blows my mind. We had a schedule, and once you got your deadlines understood, it's incredible what we were able to produce. This comfort wasn't just reflected in the makers of the games, but their fan base as well, with Her Interactive keeping a healthy line of communication with their fans through their fan forums. Lots of game companies either ran their own forums or trolled fan forums to get detailed product feedback from the people most engaged with their games. Companies like id, 3D Realms, and Monolith all maintained or interacted with forums like this. And naturally, among these FPS greats was the best of them all, Nancy Drew. Her Interactive forums were originally started when Mackenzie & Co. was released for girls to talk about makeup and fashion, but as the company shifted to Nancy Drew games, the forums became active with people discussing the games, giving each other hints, helping out, and posting fan content. Fan art was so common on the forums that when the original game, Secrets Can Kill, got remade, fan art was included on some of the corkboards in the school. How does nobody recognize me? I'm Nancy Drew! There's art of me all over the place! The forums also gave players direct contact to the people making the games, with this relationship forming between players and designers, where problems could be voiced and taken into account by the people responsible for fixing them. References to fan-favorite material became more common. Memes in the community, like recycled Nancy voice lines, were used more and more commonly, including the famous "It's locked" voice line being used for the game's sound settings. Reoccurring characters would appear in multiple games in different roles, like Sonny June. Easter eggs that let the fans know that their voices were coming in loud and clear. From 1998 to 2011, Her Interactive would release Nancy games, usually twice a year, and satisfy the fan base that grew up with, or were growing up with, the games, weathering pretty much every problem the games industry was facing at the time. Nancy Drew survived World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the War on Drugs, and the War on Terror. All she cares about is the war on scallywags. In this time, Her Interactive's unchanging approach was an anomaly in the industry. Dedicated point-and-click adventure games pretty much died out in the mid to late 2000s. Except for Nancy. Her Interactive's games were the only consistently releasing games of this type, and it's incredible they lasted as long as they have. It's even more incredible when you learn the whole thing was built on a foundation of melting ice. 2011 was the first time Her would see a major shakeup to their game-making philosophy, as after 13 years of running shop, Megan Geyser was replaced by Stuart Mulder. In the opposite direction to Megan, Stuart had plenty of experience in the video game industry prior to heading up Her Interactive. And he also worked at Microsoft, except his role was entirely focused on games. He was part of the management team for the Age of Empires series, which before Halo was Microsoft's crown jewel, selling over 25 million copies. Okay, really hoping the Power Rangers don't have some connection to Age of Empires as well, otherwise this is an Age of Empires theme month. Once he was finished in that role, Stuart would transition into a role as a sort of studio scout, penning the deals that would bring studios under the Microsoft umbrella. That included, of course, the developers of their super successful Age of Empires games, Ensemble Studios, the MechWarrior creators, FASA Studio, and the biggest of all, Bungie. The Xbox doesn't survive if it doesn't have Halo Combat Evolved when it launches, so there's no exaggeration when I say that without Stuart making the deal, Microsoft's first ever console would have never gotten off the ground. There is a direct link between this man and Hudson Horstachio. Thank him! The transition from Megan Geyser to Stuart Mulder, though, wasn't a hostile takeover, as it was Megan's choice to step aside and pass the job onto Stuart. as she moved into a role described as dual leadership. Stewart was the business mind, while Megan would stay on as the creative director. As we have grown Her Interactive from a dedicated PC game developer to additional platforms, we recognize the need to expand our leadership structure to better leverage Her Interactive's native capabilities while successfully navigating the complexities of new initiatives. Those additional platforms that Megan is talking about in the release where she announces her stepping down refers to the various attempts that Her Interactive made to port their games to other consoles and find a wider audience. Message in a Haunted Mansion was ported to the Game Boy Advance, White Wolf of Ice Creek was ported to the Wii, an original Hardy Boys game was made for the DS. All their attempts to leave the PC space and expand out were met with failure. Also, White Wolf of Ice Creek and the Hardy Boys games were published by Sega? This qualifies Nancy Drew to be in Sonic Racing Crossworlds. Those failures in the past, though, the late 2000s was also the best shot for Nancy Drew to get into as many houses as she could, thanks to the rise of mobile gaming. The rise of smartphones meant that now the general public had a gaming device they could fit in their pockets. The mobile games industry was booming in a big way in the late 2000s, with hits like Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, and Fruit Ninja showing that the size of the device didn't matter. The profits would speak for themselves. Some bigger studios joined early, like Epic Games and their Infinity Blade series, or Capcom porting games like DMC4, Street Fighter 4, and Resident Evil. Guess? But Her Interactive would have a huge leg up on all these big companies, where they would either have to gut a game to get a phone to think about playing it, or invent a whole new series to play exclusively on mobile. The Nancy games seemed like done deals to work on mobile phones. They're point-and-click adventure games. On a touchscreen phone, that's perfect! The Drew games also being on such weaker tech compared to the average game released at the time meant that porting them to weaker hardware, like a phone, wouldn't present half the problems porting a console game like DMC would. Take one of the fan-favorite games, Secret of Shadow Ranch, port it to mobile, completely change the game, make it a storybook with a single word jumble in the middle. Alright! What were we saying about getting a new CEO? It was Stewart's job to make Her Interactive more profitable. And once he became CEO, he learned that not only was Her Interactive losing money, they had never actually turned a profit before. How could that be? The Nancy Drew games are popular. They win awards, they have a passionate fan base, they've released so many, how could it have possibly have never made money? Well, there are a lot of reasons, really. The Drew games have done well in context. The niche they fill is a niche of a niche. They're games for girls who don't like girl games. Are there fans outside of that niche? Of course, but it's always going to be a limited group based on how the games are marketed and who will actually buy them. That brings up another great point. A lot of what Her Interactive was doing was outdated. The tech they were using was years behind the industry standard, which led to their games looking worse than anything else releasing at the same time. At the same time, though, that wasn't an unconscious choice made by Her Interactive. Their games being so low tech was on purpose, since that meant their target audience could play it no matter what. It didn't matter if you had a high-end gaming PC or only had 10 minutes of computer time before Dad had to do the taxes. Any computer could play the Nancy Drew games, which made them really accessible to a lot of people. At the same time though, any change to the technology the team would be working on would have to be handled with the utmost care. Because the team, which, need I remind you, had barely changed since the first game, was used to working on this proprietary engine. Not just were their games outdated, but how their games were sold was outdated too. Nancy Drew games were available in two places: big box stores like Walmart and Target, and in Scholastic Book Fair mail-away pamphlets, next to the latest Animorphs book where one of the kids has to torch a refugee village. A small group of people will ever know if that's hyperbole or not. and I am not in that group. Her Interactive insisted on keeping their games primarily available in stores, since that was the easiest place for their target audience to get them. Running through the toy aisles and making it to the game aisle, and seeing the brand new Nancy game on the shelves. Unfortunately, by 2011, the sales of physical PC games had shrunk majorly. At this point, Steam was a very recognized part of the gaming landscape. The future of PC games was digital, and Her Interactive refused to adapt. The Drew games wouldn't be ported to Steam until 2017. By that point, it was way too late. And as we'll find out, they were ported during the Nancy Drew Dark Ages. If you wanted to buy a digital Nancy Drew game, your best shot was to chance getting one off of Her Interactive's website, which was an absolute disaster. The Nancy games also stopped being necessary as the girl games for girl gamers, as the industry had become less hard boy-coded and girls made up more of the gaming population. I won't say this is the biggest reason, it's my personal speculation really, but we were closer to where we are now, where everybody's a gamer to some extent, than we were before, with gaming being a solely male hobby. But that doesn't answer all of the questions. Okay, so the Drew games don't make a lot of money. If this were Nancy Drew 3, that would make sense. But Stewart took over during Nancy Drew 24! How can a series make it to 24 games and never turn a profit? Goodwill and fan sentiment don't pay electric bills. Well, prepare yourself for this one. When I did my initial research into the Drew games, I heard this point be made by a lot of people, and every time I scoffed and said, yeah, sure. I was convinced this was some sort of chaotic lawsuit situation where fans made up a reason that just got adopted as the truth because it sounded cool. Guys, this one is real. So, the reason that Her Interactive stayed afloat during their entire tour of duty with the Drew crew was because a private venture capitalist who made billions of dollars in the bioengineering field had basically written Her blank checks that allowed them to keep operating despite their low game sales. Yes, a shadow billionaire was pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into Nancy Drew games. And you might rightly assume that this had to be for some sort of sinister reason, maybe to test out some new ocular drug. No, this was a completely altruistic move by whoever this was. According to Stuart Mulder, the reason they were pumping money into the franchise was because they wanted to make sure there were video games being produced that were mentally stimulating and taught kids, instead of dumbing them down with violence. I have reported a lot of stupid-sounding facts that have turned out to be true, and they've gotten dumb. But this is the most absurd one I've ever read. This did have the knock-on effect of making Her Interactive a sort of lemonade and cookies company. Not the nicest way to put it, but I mean that by having this constant cash flow that was completely separate from the sales figures for their games, it didn't give the company much incentive to switch things up and make moves that, while not being comfortable, would produce results in the long run. Moves like hiring a larger staff, upgrading the engine, prioritizing porting games and expanding their audience. These are things that came back to bite Her in a big way as they continued to release games. Without the fear of death that most companies have due to their constant cash flow that they didn't really need to do anything to acquire, Her Interactive wasn't able to compete when competition was necessary. Now at the same time, this safety net is largely the reason Her was able to become the wonderful place to work at that it was known as. If the company had to prioritize the bottom line, it's likely to be run a lot like any other business, which would eventually lead to hurt feelings and bad stories. I'll say this, the company was insanely lucky to have the sort of backing that it did. But when Stewart entered with the goal of making the company profitable, the first thing that had to be addressed was this near sole reliance on the backing of a mystery man. If the bottom ever fell out on the mystery industry and this investor pulled out, the company was finished. So began Stewart's main objective during his time as CEO of Her Interactive, which was to secure investors and therefore secure Her's financial future. Here's the thing though. The gaming industry, especially in the early 2010s, was investing primarily in startups, companies that had a lot of upward mobility that could return the investment the investors made. So when a 10-year-old company like Her comes asking investors for money, they're going to be gun-shy. This is an over-decade-old company that, in its existence, has never turned a profit. In the eyes of investors, it's better to invest in an unstable stock that could yield success than one that's a known failure, and has been for over 10 years. Investors saw Her Interactive as a bum stock, and so getting funding became increasingly difficult. What made it even harder was the truth that Her's biggest franchise was a licensed one. And the license for Nancy Drew ain't cheap. They weren't just slapping the name Nancy Drew onto their own original stories either. No, all but one of the Nancy games is based on pre-existing Nancy Drew books, which means that they were paying the publishers, Simon & Schuster, out the nose for the rights to characters, plots, settings, and concepts. So investors were hesitant to invest in a property that wasn't owned by the people they were funding. A lot of their money wouldn't go to funding the projects themselves, it would instead go into funding the rights to make those projects. For their parts, neither Simon nor Schuster were helping out, as they refused to do any promo work to let people know these games existed. The only way you could figure out about them was by either already being a fan, seeing the game on store shelves, or, legitimately, scholastic book fairs that would carry the games. Stewart's search to find people willing to fund the future of Her Interactive had largely come up bust. This game company still only had one primary source of income, and it wasn't the games they were making. During this time, Megan Geyser also left the creative lead position she transitioned into after abdicating the CEO position to Stewart. And now the person who had led the company wasn't just not in charge, she wasn't in the company, period. The mounting pressure eventually got to Stewart, who would fall ill during his time as Her CEO, and force him to take a leave of absence. Is what the employees thought was the reason Stewart wasn't showing up to work. One sick day, and people were thinking, oh man, I hope Stewart gets better. 2 sick days in, people thought, oh, wow, Stewart must be really sick. A week of sick days in, and people thought, well, Stewart's dead. So, when was Stewart coming back? The answer was never, because Stuart Mulder left Her Interactive in such an abrupt manner, nobody at the company realized he was gone until a week after he did it. Now, for as much as I want to sympathize with the poor guy, because doing research really revealed just how much of a Herculean feat Stewart had set up in front of him, leaving the team high and dry like that does suck, and Stewart admits as much. This is a quote inside of a quote from an interview done with Stuart Mulder by Elizabeth Balu for a Kotaku article called The Case of the Disappearing Nancy Drew Video Games, which was able to contact a lot of former and even current employees of Her to ask the same question I am. What is happening to these games? What I tried to do hadn't been successful. It was emotional, he said, to leave knowing he hadn't done what he had come to Her Interactive to do. I didn't handle my departure well. I was embarrassed. It was just... He sighed. Ugh. Her was in a situation where their old CEO was gone, their new CEO was gone, so who was gonna tell him what to do? In a move that would have warmed the cockles of old man Marx's heart, the workers seized the means of production and, for a time, Her just operated without a CEO. This is while they were deep into development on the next game in the franchise, Labyrinth of Lies. Stewart left in the middle of 2014 after they had just finished shipping Shattered Medallion. So at least a month of work on Labyrinth of Lies, or in Nancy years, a sixth of the game's development, was done without a CEO. It wouldn't stay that way forever though, as by September of 2014, they would elect their latest and most controversial CEO. Penny Milliken is a very hard figure to talk about and do research on. In the community that knows she exists, the Nancy Drew one, she is so goddamn hated that trying to find a video or article about her where the comment section isn't full of people dumping on her is impossible. The very first thing that shows up when you Google her name is a Reddit thread called "Penny Milliken really is a vile, evil person." Getting an unbiased look at who Penny is and what she did for, and to her interactive, is hard. I doubt even I, the paragon of impartiality, will be able to keep bias out of this. I'll do my best to present things as they happened, and if you feel like getting a job at her afterwards to leave a bad Glassdoor review, buddy, that's all up to you. Penny Milliken is on the Megan Geyser side of the CEO spectrum, where unlike Stewart, she didn't have much experience in game making, but like Megan, had experience for over 10 years in a different field, in this case as the marketing director at Disney. During those 10 years, she would serve on the board of directors for her, which meant that she wasn't an outsider like Stewart was. Where Stewart, though, was mostly concerned with matters outside of the company, like securing funding, Penny was much more interested in shaking up the internal structure of her. Penny's ascension in September of 2014 coincided with the end of development on Labyrinth of Lies and the start of development on Sea of Darkness. Remember when I said there was only one Nancy Drew game with a story not based on a pre-existing Nancy Drew book? Sea of Darkness is it. This is purely speculation on my part, it's never been confirmed something like this ever happened, but maybe the reason this is an original Drew story is because they didn't want to pay the additional licensing costs for one of the pre-existing ones? It's just a theory I had while doing research, and after learning what I have, it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case at this point. The game would serve as the swan song to many aspects of the Drew games that fans loved, starting with the first public change. It was announced prior to Sea of Darkness's release that this would be the final game in the series for mainstay Lonnie Minella voicing Nancy Drew. At nearly 20 years voicing the same character, this is an extremely long tenure as far as voiceover goes, and the shift away was one that fans were incensed by. The official reason given was that they wanted to find an actor who could better suit Nancy's intended age range of 18 years old, as well as find somebody more local to where they would be recording the games, in Seattle as opposed to where Lonnie lived in Slam Diego. It would also cost less to go with an actor who had a lower rate than Lonnie did, who as an industry vet could afford to charge more for her work. Now on the one hand, I do understand the reasoning from her perspective. Lonnie was well into her 60s by the release of Sea of Darkness, and even at the beginning of the series, she never sounded like the age Nancy was supposed to be. Wanting to make your teenage detective sound like a teenager isn't an unreasonable ask. On the other hand, Lonnie's more mature performance as Nancy Drew had become iconic to fans of the series, and her age never impacted her performance. And based on how violent the fan backlash was, it had become a fan-favorite part of the games. The announcement of Lonnie's replacement was met with immediate fan backlash. It was universally decried as a bad move and led to a lot of goodwill being lost. Truly, the only positive to come out of it was that Lonnie got the chance to see how much her performance meant to the fans. Another speculative thing on my end is that when new CEOs enter companies, they like to make an immediate and lasting impact. And so maybe in an attempt to make her tenure as CEO feel impactful, Penny changed an iconic aspect of the franchise. The next thing that would be leaving her interactive was their in-house engine. Having used it from the very start, it was a piece of tech that hadn't seen any major updates in years, but was also a familiar tool to those who had used it for so long. Learning to use a new engine was going to take loads of time and resources. on top of the time spent figuring out which engine to actually go with. Eventually, it was decided that Unity would be their best choice thanks to its ease of learning and versatility, allowing the company to finally capitalize on that mobile market they'd always wanted to break into. Instead of it being a smooth transition, though, longtime developers found the change to be jarring and difficult. It was a nice pipe dream that everyone could learn to use Unity in a month and we'd all ride off into the sunset and make games for mobile and PC in Unity. But how exactly was that gonna happen? And nobody had a good answer because nobody had the expertise. So, what was the solution to your team not being able to adapt to the change from one engine to the next? Bye-bye. The last thing to go was the team of 30 that had developed the previous 32 Nancy Drew games. Starting in March of 2015, only a few months before Sea of Darkness's release. A large amount of the staff had been fired, and the work they would have done was given to contractors. People hired for a limited time to do a job and then get out. This was something Her could hang its hat on for a long time, having never done to a major extent, thanks to the security of the original staff. But now a large amount of them were gone, and even more quit in the years that followed due to the difficulties surrounding their next release. Oh yeah, Sea of Darkness still teased the next game in the franchise, Midnight in Salem, despite the only work that was done on the game being the teaser itself. They didn't make any progress because the team couldn't figure out the engine, and they couldn't figure out the engine because there was no team. Her Interactive had to do the unthinkable and delay a Drew game. There would be no companion title in 2015 like there had been in every year previous. And to give their developers more time to figure out what to do, they delayed the release of Midnight in Salem to 2016. If the removal of Lonnie Minella caused community backlash, the engine swap and removal of the original team was like a goddamn war crime to the Drew crew. Glassdoor, a website where employees can review their workplaces, had previous employees from Her Interactive post reviews, which were scathing, with calls for the closure of the studio due to poor leadership and a shift towards a more toxic work environment following the switch to Penny from Stewart. Fan outrage kept building more and more as Midnight in Salem would miss release date after release date, and fans who tried voicing their complaints the way they'd always done before suddenly found that to be a lot harder. The forums, which had been host to feedback both positive and negative, were suddenly much more moderated, with critical posts often being deleted the most. We don't do that at all, and this is something I directly manage. We have a very liberal social media policy, and we're fine with criticism. The only time we ban people is when they use certain language or make personal attacks against employees. Things of that nature we will not put up with, and then we would ban them, or ban them for a short period of time. These are the words of the director of marketing for Her, Jared Neuenhaus. Jared is another figure that gets a lot of hate from the Clue-munity because, as the guy handling a lot of PR for Her, he often has to say things that fans either don't agree with or don't believe. It especially got a lot harder to swallow, as Midnight in Salem wasn't just the first game to miss the twice-a-year release schedule, but it missed the year after that, the year after that, and the year after that. We went from 2 Drew games a year to waiting 4 before getting a single one. This turnaround time was like poison for many people's interest in the games. Not even porting the previous 32 games to Steam was enough to quell mounting fan frustration. The audience for the Drew games, even more so than the young player base it was intended for, was young adults who had played when they were younger and became hooked. At least that's the most vocal camp. These games are comfort games for a lot of people, and in an instant, a schedule that, for a lot of people, had been maintained for their entire lives, was just upended and changed. What used to be transparent and approachable became shrouded and uncertain. What was a close-knit community became fractured. and what was consistent became unpredictable. Even previous developers were voicing their doubts on whether or not the newest game would ever come out. "I don't think Her Interactive is salvageable at this point," said one. "I really just want the story to be told so that fans have some closure. It's like a missing child case. They're waiting for little Billy to come home, and I'm like, I'm sorry, but Midnight in Salem is never, ever coming out." When Midnight in Salem finally did come out, getting delays up until the very last second, if you look past the reviews that were going to hate it no matter what, thanks to the pre-release scuttlebutt, it was fine. It wasn't a world-changing game, not even by Drew standards. The story was good, the graphics were passable, the new voices were well done, and the puzzles were fine. Most telling of all, though, was the final breaking of traditions when the game ended and had no trailer. Well, not for the next Drew game, but there was a trailer for an upcoming Nancy Drew movie starring Sophia Lillis of It and Dungeons & Dragons fame. Honestly, if anything spoke to the shaky ground the studio now stood on, it was this. Even Secrets Can Kill, the very first game, promised a new one. This one, though, leaves you with no hope for the future. Following the reception to Midnight in Salem, there would be work done to try to recoup their standing with fans of the franchise, because yes, Her Interactive still wasn't done. It would take another 4 years, which, for games that look like this, is hard to believe, but in the meantime, they did a great job with community interaction. Constant posts to social media with clues and hints for what the next game would be. Interactive puzzles to get information that were engaging and interesting. YouTube videos dedicated to fan content produced for the series. They really wanted to earn back trust that had been lost. Unfortunately, the game that followed, Mystery of the Seven Keys, was again met with near-universal backlash from the audience that mattered the most, pre-established Nancy Drew fans. The graphics saw an upgrade, but fans still didn't really like the direction that Her Interactive had taken things. It became a common sentiment among comments and reviews that if this is how it was going to be, I'm done supporting Nancy Drew games. This didn't quite reach the same levels of hatred for the studio like it did in 2015 or 2019 when the Layoffs were made or Midnight in Salem launched, but I'd put that less down to more fans being satisfied, and more that there are less fans, period. Researching all of this information was not as fun as I had hoped. I mean, I enjoyed doing it, reading through all the info, reading this Nancy Drew history book by Melanie Rahak, watching videos on the subject of Nancy Drew from channels like Ashley Norton, Carter Plays, and Snuggly has been a great experience. But I mean, just my feelings at the end, now that we're at the present day, are conflicted. It's clear that what Her Interactive is doing isn't working. Their goal of getting new fans isn't bearing fruit, and their catering to older fans isn't working either. I think that if Her Interactive didn't have this manna from heaven in the form of this private investor, we'd have seen the studio shut down or producing much different content than they did for all those years. Games would have kept up with emerging technologies. Profits would have been more prioritized. Ports and expansions of the brand would have happened much sooner than it did. That's not the company Her Interactive was, though. It's a company that was incredibly lucky. For years and years, they were able to create games that they enjoyed, for fans that loved them, and made themselves a part of a lot of people's lives for years. For all of the trouble and bad decisions made in the meantime, that can't be forgotten. Her Interactive was a huge part of so many people's lives. In the same way Nancy Drew made it possible for girls to imagine themselves in the same positions Nancy was in, Her Interactive's Drew games made it so girls could enjoy video games. It was the midpoint between real video games and girl video games. But they weren't stepping stones or a graduation into more mainstream stuff. They were in a niche that they filled really, really well. Even if the glory days seem to be well and truly past, that doesn't mean the hope is gone. Based on social media, there are still people working in the company who want to celebrate the fandom that Nancy has accrued, and who love the community. And there's a community that wants to love them back. Even if their story is a little unbelievable, I'm glad these games were made, and could be what they were for as long as they could. Anyway, in less depressing news, join us next time for the next week in the worst month of my life as we tackle Power Rangers Jungle Fury.